Hello and salam. Welcome to the Muslim Viewpoint, a new podcast series brought to you by American Muslim Today. We are a groundbreaking non-profit digital newspaper which champions civic engagement by informing and empowering the diverse voices of almost 30 million Muslims here in the US and other Western countries. I'm Rifat Malik. I am AMT's editor-in-chief, and today we have an interview with a man who has the distinction of recently being appointed to the Faith-Based Security Council by the Department of Homeland Security. Salam Al-Marayati, president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, or MPAC, will join a group of more than 20 other members to advise the DHS secretary on ways to facilitate trust between the Muslim community and the government, as well as develop ways to ensure the safety and infrastructure of places of worship. Well, earlier this week, he spoke to AMT's reporter Hadiya Spahalic.
It entails what the title indicates, and that is we are there to advise the Secretary of Homeland Security on issues pertinent to our Muslim community, as other faith leaders will do the same for their communities. So the issues that are important to us are protecting our houses of worship, our mosques. Do we have enough of an infrastructure to support the mosques and secure them? What are the recommendations we can give to the government to enhance security for the mosques? How Muslims feel about security and being securitized, which is the other side of the issue. In other words, are we securitizing mosques too much? And they're feeling like they're always under the scrutiny of the government, and Big Brother is watching. What we need to do to alleviate those fears and to reform policies so in actuality it's not happening. These are the kinds of issues that I'm thinking about right now as we begin deliberating as a commission.
And I know as one of the co-founders and as president of MPAC, you guys have done a lot of work to tackle stereotypes and kind of dismantle preconceived negative notions about Muslims in America. So can you tell me a little bit about some of the campaigns you and your organization have undertaken and the kind of impact that they've had?
Well, I think the first objective that we had 35 years ago when we started the Muslim Public Affairs Council is to create a new line of leaders. And I'm very proud of the work that we've done in the Young Leaders Program that we have developed, we've supported, we've funded, we've guided, and now you see a culture of leadership in our community from Muslims in their 20s and 30s. That in and of itself changes people's perceptions about our community. That in and of itself enhances the public understanding of Islam. We are pivoting from the frame on Islam being coming from the Middle East to the frame of Islam coming from within America. And so strategically, we had made that decision, and we see the fruition of that now with many faces of Islam throughout the country, and that in and of itself has improved the public understanding of Islam. Secondly, of course, is the media. The media in terms of news media now, social media, Hollywood media, stories that are produced about Muslims, making better stories, making Muslims control their own narratives on storytelling about our community. That's something else that we've done through our Hollywood Bureau and through our engagement with media in general. The third aspect is tackling the tough issues. There are issues within our community that people have apprehensions about. For example, we just did a podcast about child marriage and that it is unfounded in the Quran. Unfortunately, the main opponents that we have in delivering that message are Muslims themselves who believe that Aisha radiallahu anha was married as a child and so on and so forth. So we have to go into our own religion and develop a better understanding of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad peace and blessings be upon him, and our understanding of the Quran for that matter, and some of the things that are used to oppress women, to oppress minorities, to violate religious freedom, to promote violence. These are the issues that need reform. And it's not changing the Quran or the Sunnah. It is changing our understanding in a way that aligns with the Islamic ethics taught to us by the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And they are the ethics of human dignity, of decency, of being the ones who protect people's rights. And unfortunately, that is not the image that is emanating from the Muslim world today. We all know the problems. These are things that need changing in order to improve public understanding of Islam and Muslims.
I do have a couple follow-up questions about your answer here. You mentioned several not organizations, but several groups and bureaus within your organization. Can you tell me a little bit about the Young Leaders Program and the Hollywood Bureau specifically?
Sure. The Young Leaders Program has been something that we've had for about 20 years. And we would take young Muslims to Washington, and we had a Young Leaders Summit. And we'd bring 20 of them, and for a week we would orient them on MPAC's mission. The basis of it is Islam. What are the Islamic principles that drives MPAC? And then how we engage with government. And so we would go take them to the White House and the Congress and think tanks and the partner organizations, and that would give them a new way of looking at Washington. That Washington is not our enemy, but is simply a tool, and how to use that tool to benefit our community. From that, we developed the Congressional Internship Program called CLDP, Congressional Leadership Development Program, and you can find it on the website cldp.org. And CLDP is now an 8-week program where Congress asks us to find internships for Muslims. We go in and have a selection process where we find the best and the brightest and take them to Washington. We give them housing, we give them a stipend. We also train them on how Washington works. They work in the day on the Hill in Congress, and then at night we have meetings and classes for them. That is a very intense program. Some of them then graduate to actually become staff people in Washington, D.C. So we're building a Muslim brain trust for Washington. That's the idea. Then we have fellowships where we bring in young Muslims, give them stipends and grants so that they study very particular, specific issues involving healthcare, education, national security, and civil liberties. So that is the Young Leaders Program in our organization, what we call now the Young Leaders Institute.
And the Hollywood Bureau?
The Hollywood Bureau is a continuous effort of bringing young Muslim talent, screenwriters, and also as people who can pitch stories, who would get their stories not only heard but accepted. And so we would have writing labs, we would have screenwriters workshops, we would have other networking opportunities with their studios, and bring that talent to Hollywood. So we're actually building a Muslim brain trust for Hollywood, just like we're doing for Washington.
Earlier we were talking about some issues that Muslims might have been facing, and I want to touch on another. Why do you think there is still that Islamic or Muslim extremism perception in the U.S. that Muslims are kind of the root of terrorism and the problem of terrorism, when research shows that it's white nationalism now that's much more pervasive?
Well, that's a PR problem. And let's face it, our enemies have invested more in PR than we have. And when I mean by PR, I don't mean, public relations is a very important issue for us to study as Muslims. The Quran stipulates that part of the zakat can be used to soften the hearts of others. So the question for us is, where do we allocate our budget in softening the hearts of others? And how do we engage others? We tend to speak only to ourselves, which amounts to just crying on each other's shoulders or blaming each other for the problems, and we just get depressed. The Quran gives us a mechanism to get out of that rut. It says, use your zakat money to engage the others. It says, repel evil with good, so that the one with whom there's enmity becomes as if he is your closest and warmest friend. And we're just not applying those Quranic mandates. So our approach then is that we have to invest in engaging others. So it's not necessarily the PR, like we write a press release and we go and schmooze with Hollywood and New York executives and media and try to get polished stories about us. No, it's about changing hearts and minds within media so that they become our allies. That we convert them from being our political opponents or political enemies to becoming our allies and political friends. Building that alliance will then help leverage media in a way to get better stories told about Muslims. So that's one reason. The other reason is because we have enemies. And if those enemies did not do their jobs, they would be replaced with other people who become better enemies to us. In other words, there are people who do not like Islam and Muslims having a strong voice in America, because that means they would have to share the power. They would have to cut up the political pie, and we would have our peace. Keith Ellison said, you better have a seat at the table, because if you're not at the seat at the table, you will be the menu of the table. People will eat you up. So it's not rocket science. We know what's happening. We know why. We just have to think about what we need to do to change the dynamic. And just complaining about it in khutbahs and blaming everybody and not taking responsibility is not the way to change the situation. So that is how we feel that MPAC, Muslim Public Affairs Council, and groups like MPAC now, we have an ecosystem of organizations working in that, are changing the culture so that we are respected and accepted and have a seat at the table. And now we are part of the decision-making process that in and of itself will change the perception that Muslims are the ones to blame, and terrorism is a Muslim problem, whereas everybody knows that it is actually the worst terrorists now are white and Christian. They represent the largest threat to our national security, according to the FBI and the CIA and the whole national security apparatus. The last thing I want to say about that is that we have to change the national security system in this country. The national security system that spends about $1 trillion a year in fighting wars overseas and then having surveillance here is not giving us real security because of two problems. One, most of it is spent on fighting so-called Islamists. And then when that happens, that's all you hear about. People are afraid. And who are they afraid of? They're afraid of you and me. They're afraid of Muslims. We have to change that. We change that by providing an alternative. National security is one part of our policy. It should not be the predominant part of our policy. What we believe it should be predominant is human security. National security is how we secure the state apparatus and our alliances throughout the world. In other words, it's geopolitics. Why did we go to the Ukraine? Because of NATO. Why did we not care of Syria? Because there's no real oil interests there. And if anything, we don't want things to change in Syria, because that might change the situation in Israel, which is part of the geopolitical setup. So let's not do anything in Syria. Why do we support a dictatorship in Egypt and a monarchy in Saudi Arabia? Because they align with our geopolitical interests. Why do we support the demise of Imran Khan in Pakistan? Because he does not support military bases in his country that we can use, the United States can use for geopolitical interests. That's our national security system. It's a mess. It needs an overhaul. It needs to be changed altogether. So that change to us is human security. Human security, which was established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, talks about the freedom from fear. In other words, removing war and violence from these countries. It talks about the freedom from what? In other words, economic opportunity in those countries. It talks about freedom of expression. In other words, if people say something about our policy, they should not be threatened. They should not be assassinated. People are assassinated every day in Palestine. What are we saying about it? Nothing. We turn a blind eye to those assassinations. But when something happens in Iran, oh my God, it's the end of the world. And so people support what's happening in the revolution now in Iran, not because they care about Iran, but because of geopolitical interests. So these are the realities that we have to look at in changing, and human security is the way to change it. Human security provides religious freedom. In other words, people can be of a certain religious, conservative or liberal way without threat. So we have to change our national security apparatus so that it's not used to fight Muslims. It's not used for more wars against Muslims. And we still have that problem, even though we've left Iraq as a country, we've left Afghanistan as a country, but that idea of war and that idea of fighting Islamic groups is still a big part of U.S. policy. And by the way, and that's what leads to people fearing Muslims. You cannot remove the gravity of the situation, even though we can repeat until we're blue in the face. Hey, white supremacist violence is the major threat to this country. Oh, people say, oh, okay. But then once somebody says Al-Qaeda or ISIS or this, you might have one person in our neighborhood who might be saying, okay, Al-Qaeda is this or that, and shows that we have to look at the policies that created Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The whole world turns upside down and says this guy might be sympathizing with terrorism.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that like a lot of Muslims and Muslim communities, as a result of all of this, have a strong distrust for the government and law enforcement because of things like, you know, the Patriot Act and the Muslim ban. And we also recently saw, you know, the Supreme Court side with the FBI in regards to the surveilling of Muslims. So how do you and the Faith-Based Security Council hope to facilitate and garner this trust between the Department of Homeland Security and these communities?
Yeah, I think what we can do is exactly what you just said, is that you point to these problems, say Muslims are still viewed as suspects. Mm-hmm. How can we view Muslims as partners and force the Department of Homeland Security to review their policies and come up with ways to build trust? There is no trust, right? Very little trust, if any. So that's what we're intending to do. I have to tell you also, alhamdulillah, you know, there are now Muslims working in the Department of Homeland Security thinking about these issues that you just articulated and going to their superiors in Homeland Security saying, we have to change this. So we are in a better position now than we were 4 years ago. And people are looking at these issues to make changes. So we still have the problems. I'm not saying the problems are solved, but there are more people inside our government that are working towards those problems. I feel like that's the way to change. I understand there's a need to protest and there's a need to go to the court and sue the government on these issues. I personally don't think that that's the way to solve the problem. Because, as you just said, the cards in the courts are still stacked against us, right? Because all the government has to do is say, well, this is for national security reasons. And the court says, well, the government has the right of national security. We don't have any say in that. The executive branch has the say in it. The judicial branch does not. This was by the way, this was the whole argument of the White House and the executive branch in justifying Japanese American internment camps. And the famous case of Korematsu, the man who went and said that this was a violation of his civil rights, his civil liberties. In interning him, the government said, oh, we had to do it for national security reasons, and the Supreme Court sided with the government. The same thing is happening to this day. So we should know that going into these cases. That's why I believe we have to create changes within the government first before we're going to see more victories in the courts on these issues. And there have been victories. I don't want to downplay it, and I'm not saying don't use the litigation route. Definitely use it, but understand what the limitations are. Mm-hmm. We're utilizing the government engagement, the civic engagement route, and I think those two should work hand in hand. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And as someone who has been involved in Muslim advocacy work since the 80s, how far do you think Muslims have come in terms of electoral and civic engagement, and what more do you think needs to be done?
We've come a long way, but we've only scratched the surface. I mean, before, who would imagine? What is it now? About 15 or 20 Muslims are now in state houses. Mm-hmm. We've never had that before. Mm-hmm. We've never had three Muslims in the U.S. Congress, and Andrew Carson, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib all won their re-election. Keith Ellison won re-election by very thin, narrow margin to remain as Attorney General for the state of Minnesota. The only Attorney General in the country that has won a case against police brutality, I believe. So we've come a long way, and alhamdulillah, it's looking back from where we were to where we are now. It's leaps and bounds that we've made progress in that arena. But at the end of the day, when you count how many of us there are in that arena and how many others there are, we're still very few. And we might just be very few because we're only 1% of the population. So we have to think strategically, what are the strategic alliances we need in our country, including alliances with people that may have been our opponents in the past, like evangelicals. Because there are evangelicals that want to engage with Muslims. So how can we engage them and develop alliances? We did a story of somebody in Lubbock, Texas, a woman who saved lives during COVID. We called the movie The Healer because not only did she heal people from the virus, but she healed people in terms of spiritual and social rejuvenation in healing the country. That's the approach we need to take, to use our successes and leverage them so that it disproportionately benefits society, and we are seen as a benefit, and that will give us more security and more success in the long run.
Well,
so it's really about leadership. How are Muslims leaders in politics, leaders in media, leaders in science, leaders in technology, leaders in education? That leadership in each and every one of those fields needs to be leveraged and that will benefit society, which will then Islam will get the credit, and Muslims will gain their rights that way. That's our theory of change.
For joining us, and from me and our team here at AMT, Hadiya Spalic and Maya Gaylor. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter and TikTok at American Muslim Today. And if you'd like to read more about this story and access more digital content, feel free to check out our website, AmericanMuslimToday.com. See you next week.